There are generally three types of personal documents: letters, diaries, photographs, internet, blogging, Facebook, MySpace, etc. These would all be classed as personal documents, or possibly text messages as well. There are also public documents. Now, these are documents produced by agencies such as the government, welfare, schools. Documents might include things like Ofsted reports, minutes from a meeting, and so forth. There would also be public documents that are created by agencies such as the police and the NHS, but these would be considered private and actually quite difficult to gain access to. And finally, there are also historical documents. Any document created in the past which can be used to gain insight into a previous social activity. This data is often used in comparison with most recent activity. When studying the past, there really is only this data available. So technically, a newspaper printed today is already a historical document because it's out of date, so it tells us about the past. Thinking about a bit of research that's used historical documents, you might want to think about Mick Robbie's study looking at how women were portrayed on magazine covers about 20 years ago compared with more recently, and argued that the roles of women seem to have changed based on the stories that were printed on the front of the covers. So how do sociologists actually analyse documents? Well, there are two different forms. The first one is what's known as formal content analysis. This would be a way of possibly collecting quantitative data from documents. This is where you might classify and quantify the content of a document in an objective way. So one way you might do this is count the number of times certain items appear. So linking back to the example of the magazines, you might want to count the number of times boyfriend appears. And if it appears very often, you may well say these magazines seem to be more concerned with girls and relationships as opposed to girls in employment. The second one is what's known as a thematic analysis, okay? And this is when a sociologist might examine a document or a letter and see how it creates a particular impression. Now, this would produce qualitative data because the researchers are required to use their own skills of interpretation to generate an idea of what the theme or the impression the document's trying to create. Don't forget, things like photos can be used for this, okay? So photos can give an impression of how someone was feeling or what was going on, but it is generally our best guess. So in that sense, it is a little bit subjective. For example, when looking at how certain groups are treated, okay, some groups may be presented as a problem when you look at the media, okay? And a good example is the one I've just placed on this PowerPoint. Hoodies rob garage. Detectives have renewed their witness appeal after 2 hoodies robbed a garage. The tone of this is clearly trying to create an impression that these people were possibly young, okay, and probably male. You'd associate with hoodies. Clearly, hoodies, the clothing, could never rob a garage, but they're talking about the people wearing them, and they've labelled them in that way, and they're treating them very negatively. Just thinking about personal documents, these are the documents that people create in the course of their lifetime. So very personal things like diaries, photographs, mementos that they keep behind. These can paint a current picture of someone, or you might want to look at something from a historical perspective and examine how that person might have changed. I would say things like Facebook profiles and Facebook timelines would be fascinating to look at and examine, because you could observe the sorts of statuses people were uploading up from when they joined Facebook until now, and you can actually track their interests. So at the very early days, it might have been about going out and seeing friends and socializing, and then you might see things like marriage becoming more apparent, and boyfriend, and then maybe children. So you can gain quite a lot of insight into someone's life just by examining the personal document of their Facebook page. When examining personal documents, however, there are some issues. So if you could annotate on the PowerPoint what pervert evaluation issues you can think of for personal documents, particularly around the problem of access, which is a practical issue, and maybe some of the ethical problems. It's also worth remembering that even though diaries might give you great insight into how someone was feeling, they may not actually be the truth. That person may be trying to create an impression or might even be lying to themselves. Official documents are things produced by companies, organisations or the government. So things like bills would probably be considered an official document. Ones that we're more likely to come across in education are things like Ofsted reports, which will be a mixture of text and figures, okay, so a bit of quantitative and qualitative. Things like official coroner's reports you have here on the right-hand side. A coroner is someone whose job it is to determine how someone died. So not in the sense of what they call a pathologist or something, who might look at a dead body and actually look for the cause. A coroner will weigh up all of the evidence placed in front of them and decide whether someone was committed suicide or whether someone died by accident. Other official documents might be quite detailed and very lengthy, and a good example of this is the Stephen Lawrence report. Okay, now nothing to do with education necessarily. However, the Stephen Lawrence report is famous because it uncovered institutional racism within the police force, which has got cut off your PowerPoint, so apologies for that. A very famous report and very, very detailed. All the information was collected from a range of interviews, from a range of sources, from looking at data, and this report was produced that said the police is institutionally racist. They treat cases of black crime unfairly, and there's not enough black people actually within the police force to make it representative of the population. So very interesting. Documents can also come from the mass media and the internet, okay? And there are a huge variety of text, sounds and images produced that are available on such a large scale. And they can be quite handy for gaining some insight into what's going on in society and what views are prevalent and any themes that people feel uncomfortable about. So, for example, when you look at EastEnders, they do tend to cover controversial topics, maybe things like drug abuse, abortion, sex before marriage, which might not be controversial anymore. But many of them have also covered the issues around paedophilia more recently. And if you looked at the content and compared EastEnders now to 20 years ago, for example, they wouldn't have dreamt of covering something like paedophilia because it's been seen as too shocking to put on TV. But now we know that it's a real social issue. So examining the content of soap operas is actually one way of gaining insight into the sorts of issues that people are interested in or concerned about in mainstream society. You can clearly do content analysis also of things like newspapers, what sort of language newspapers use, what sorts of people do they talk about. It's an interesting fact that since 9/11, I think the word Muslim or Islam has appeared in red tops 80% more times than they were appearing prior to 9/11. So that should tell you that the mass media has become very interested in stories about Islam and Muslims. Okay, and as I mentioned before, you can also look at the internet, okay, which is a form of personal document when you talk about someone's personal Facebook page. So how can we actually assess the quality of these documents? And again, apologies, the formatting has gone a bit funny on this. Well, there are 4 kinds of tests. There is authenticity. Okay, and authenticity simply means, is it genuine or accurate? Okay, is it the real thing, and is it painting an accurate picture of what happened? Okay, so a diary may well be genuine, but it might not actually be accurately interpreting what actually happened. Credibility is a very interesting one. Is it believable? And was the author neutral? That should say. So clearly, again, a diary would not be neutral because the author would be telling everything from their perspective. Whereas you would expect a newspaper report to be a bit more neutral, but we know that newspapers tend to have either a right-wing or a left-wing bias, okay? But when it comes to official reports produced by the government, such as Ofsted, we would expect them to be neutral. And if they're anything but neutral, that is actually quite a bad thing because it means that they're not being unbiased. Representativeness, very important. Is the document you're looking at or the programme, is it typical? Is it typical of that age group? Is it typical of what's going on in other soap operas? Is that letter that you're looking at typical of other letters that were written home around about that time? And does it actually reflect all the groups involved, or just a particular narrow group that seemed to have had an event occur to them? And finally, meaning. Okay, what does the document mean to the writer, and what does it mean to the audience? Okay, so if it's very meaningful, okay, or if the writer wrote it in a particular way, so if they wrote a letter to someone and they meant it in a friendly way, but then someone interpreted it as they'd been actually quite nasty to them, that's when the issue of meaning is a useful tool to evaluate the usefulness of documents. So just quickly, can you check your understanding and answer these exam questions on the use of documents? I'll be checking these in lesson. So there's 1, 2, 3 questions, 2 marks, 4 marks, and 8 marks. And you can use your book and your notes. Thank you.